Welcome to our deep dive. We're tackling Kevin Murphy's Machine Learning, a probabilistic perspective.
Oh, a classic.
It is. And this book is really special.
How so?
Well, it doesn't just throw algorithms at you. It gives you this whole framework for understanding how machine learning works, like why it works the way it does.
Yeah, most machine learning resources kind of jump right into the algorithms.
Exactly.
But Murphy takes a step back and says, hold on, let's
Yeah.
really understand the probabilistic foundations first.
That's what I found so refreshing about this book. It's like he's saying, learn the rules of the game before you start playing.
I like that analogy.
Most machine learning books are like, here's how to build a model that predicts X.
Right.
But Murphy's is more like, here's how to build a model that not only predicts X, but also tells you how confident it is in that prediction.
Exactly. And that confidence level is crucial, especially, when you're using machine learning to make decisions.
Oh, absolutely.
Especially in fields like finance or healthcare, you really need to know how much you can trust the model's predictions.
For sure. A model that's 99% sure is way more useful than one that's just giving you a 50-50 guess.
Absolutely.
So how does Murphy actually build that confidence into his models?
Well, that's where Bayesian inference comes in.
Okay, Bayesian inference. I've heard that term thrown around a lot.
Sure.
To be honest with you, I'm still a little fuzzy on what it actually means. Can you break it down for me?
Yeah, so Bayesian inference is a way of updating our beliefs as we get more data.
Okay.
So imagine you have a hypothesis about something.
Okay.
You start with a prior belief, which is kind of what you think is likely based on your existing knowledge.
Right.
Then, as you gather new evidence, you update that belief to form a posterior belief.
Interesting.
So it's this continuous process of learning and refinement.
So it's not about sticking to your initial assumptions.
Right.
It's about being open to changing your mind as you learn more.
Precisely. And this is incredibly powerful in machine learning because it allows our models to adapt and improve as they encounter new data.
That's fascinating. So how does this Bayesian approach actually play out in the different types of machine learning, like supervised versus unsupervised learning?
That's a great question. Let's start with supervised learning.
Okay.
So in this type of learning, you have labeled data.
Okay.
It's like having a teacher who tells you the right answer for each example.
So the model's basically learning from a set of examples.
Yes.
Where the correct output is already known.
Exactly. The model learns to map inputs to outputs based on these labeled examples, and then it can use that knowledge to make predictions on new, unseen data. But what's interesting is how a probabilistic lens enhances this process.
Okay.
We're not just looking for any mapping.
Yeah.
We're looking for the mapping that's most likely given the data we've seen.
So it's bringing in probability to refine the learning process,
Exactly.
even in something that feels very straightforward, like supervised learning.
Exactly. Now, unsupervised learning is a bit different.
Okay.
In this case, you don't have labeled data.
Got it.
It's like being given a puzzle without the picture on the box.
So the model has to figure out the patterns and structure all on its own.
Exactly. And here, the probabilistic approach is crucial for things like clustering,
Okay.
where we try to group similar data points together. Bayesian methods can help us determine the optimal number of clusters
Yeah.
and the probability that a data point belongs to a particular cluster.
So even though there's no right answer given to the model in unsupervised learning,
Right.
the probabilistic perspective still helps it make sense of the data and find meaningful patterns.
Precisely. And this brings us to another important aspect of machine learning, model selection.
Right. We've built a model, we've trained it with data, but how do we know if it's any good?
That's the key question.
Yeah.
We need a way to evaluate different models and choose the one that's best for our particular problem.
I see.
And this is where Murphy's probabilistic approach really shines. He introduces concepts like Bayesian model comparison,
Okay.
which allows us to compare different models based on how well they explain the data.
So we're not just throwing darts at a board and hoping for the best.
Nope.
We're using probability to make informed choices about which model is most likely to give us reliable results.
Exactly. And by using these probabilistic techniques, we can avoid common pitfalls like overfitting.
Overfitting, remind me what that is again?
Yeah, so overfitting is when a model learns the training data too well to the point where it memorizes the specific examples
Okay.
rather than understanding the underlying patterns.
So it's like a student who can ace a test if the questions are exactly the same as the ones they studied,
Yeah.
but they completely fall apart if you change the wording or ask them to apply the concepts in a new situation.
That's a great analogy. And the problem with overfitting is that the model won't generalize well to new data. It's like a weather forecaster who predicts sunshine every day because that's what they've observed for the past week.
They're not going to be very accurate in the long run.
Exactly.
So how does Murphy's probabilistic approach help us avoid this overfitting problem?
Well, techniques like Bayesian model comparison can penalize overly complex models that are more likely to overfit.
Okay.
We're essentially trying to find a balance between a model that's complex enough to capture the patterns in the data,
Right.
but not so complex that it starts memorizing noise.
It's like Goldilocks looking for the just right model.
Exactly. And Murphy's book gives us the tools to find that sweet spot.
I like that. Now, all of these concepts we've been discussing,
Yeah,
they might seem very theoretical,
sure.
but they have some really profound implications for how machine learning is applied in the real world.
Oh, absolutely.
In fact, I'm really curious to hear more about how this probabilistic approach plays out in fields like finance, AI, and healthcare.
Yeah.
But maybe that's a topic for our next segment.
I think that's a great place to pick up next time. We can dive into specific examples and see how these probabilistic tools are changing the game in all sorts of industries.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Kevin Murphy's Machine Learning, a Probabilistic Perspective. Before the break, we were talking about how Murphy's approach helps us choose the best model for our problem. Now, I'm really interested to hear how this probabilistic perspective actually plays out in the real world. You mentioned fields like finance, AI, and healthcare. Let's start with finance. How are these ideas being used in that industry?
Well, finance is all about managing risk and making decisions under uncertainty, which makes it a perfect playground for probabilistic machine learning. One area where these techniques are having a big impact is in algorithmic trading.
Algorithmic trading. So we're talking about computer programs making trading decisions, right?
Exactly, instead of human traders making decisions based on intuition or gut feeling. These algorithms are using sophisticated models to analyze vast amounts of data, identify patterns, and make predictions about market movements. And because these models are built on a probabilistic framework,
Right.
they can quantify the uncertainty in their predictions.
So it's not just about saying buy this stock.
Right.
It's about saying buy this stock and we're 80% confident that it will go up in the next week.
Precisely. And that level of confidence is essential for managing risk. A fund manager can use that information to decide how much capital to allocate to a particular trade, knowing that there's always a chance that the prediction will be wrong.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's like the difference between betting your entire life savings on a single hand of poker
Right.
and making a calculated investment based on the odds.
Exactly.
So besides algorithmic trading, are there any other areas in finance where we're seeing this probabilistic approach being used?
Another area is fraud detection.
Okay.
Banks and credit card companies are using probabilistic models to identify transactions that are likely to be fraudulent.
How does that work?
These models look for patterns that deviate from normal behavior, such as unusual spending patterns or transactions from unfamiliar locations.
So if my credit card suddenly starts being used for online gaming purchases in a country I've never even been to,
Right.
the model will flag that as potentially suspicious.
Exactly. And because these models are probabilistic,
Uh-huh.
they can assign a score to each transaction, indicating the likelihood that it's fraudulent. This allows the bank to take appropriate actions, such as contacting the customer to verify the transaction or blocking the card altogether.
That's really impressive. It sounds like these probabilistic models are playing a huge role in keeping our financial system secure. Now let's shift gears and talk about AI. Where does this probabilistic approach fit into the world of artificial intelligence?
Well, AI is a vast field, but one area where probabilistic machine learning is having a particularly big impact is in natural language processing, NLP for short.
NLP, so this is the branch of AI that deals with understanding and generating human language, right?
Exactly, and one of the key challenges in NLP is dealing with the ambiguity and uncertainty inherent in human language.
Right, because we don't always say exactly what we mean.
Right.
And even when we do, there could be multiple interpretations of what we say.
Precisely. And this is what probabilistic models come in. For example, in machine translation, we can use probabilistic models to account for the fact that a single word in one language can have multiple possible translations in another language.
So if I'm translating a sentence from English to Spanish,
Yeah.
the model won't just pick the most common translation for each word. It will consider the context of the entire sentence and choose the translation that's most likely to convey the intended meaning.
Exactly, and this probabilistic approach has led to significant improvements in the accuracy and fluency of machine translation systems.
That's amazing. It sounds like these models are helping us break down language barriers and communicate more effectively across cultures.
Absolutely, and this is just one example. Probabilistic models are also being used in other areas of MLP, such as speech recognition, text summarization, and even chatbots.
Chatbots, that's fascinating. Are you telling me those customer service bots that pop up on websites
Uh-huh.
are actually powered by probabilistic machine learning?
Yes, many of them are. These chatbots are trained on massive data sets of conversations, and they use probabilistic models to understand the user's intent and generate appropriate responses.
Wow, I had no idea. It's amazing how much of our daily lives is already being shaped by this technology. Okay, we've talked about finance and AI. Now let's move on to healthcare. How is Murphy's probabilistic approach being applied in this field?
Well, healthcare is another domain where uncertainty is inherent, and probabilistic models are proving to be incredibly valuable. One area where we're seeing a lot of progress is in medical diagnosis.
So instead of relying solely on the doctor's experience and intuition,
Yes.
we can now use algorithms to help us identify diseases and conditions.
Exactly. These algorithms are being trained on massive data sets of medical records, including patient symptoms, test results, and treatment outcomes. And by using a probabilistic approach,
Uh-huh.
these models can not only make predictions about a patient's diagnosis, but also provide a measure of how confident they are in that prediction.
So it's not just a black and white answer.
Right.
It's a nuanced assessment that takes into account the uncertainty inherent in medical diagnosis.
Precisely. And this is incredibly important for doctors because it helps them make more informed decisions about treatment plans and further testing. For example, if a model predicts that a patient has a certain disease with 90% confidence, the doctor might feel comfortable moving forward with treatment. But if the confidence level is only 50%, the doctor might want to order additional tests before making a decision.
That makes a lot of sense. It's all about using these probabilistic tools to help doctors make the best possible decisions for their patients. Are there any other ways this approach is being used in healthcare?
Absolutely. Probabilistic models are also being used to personalize treatment plans. By taking into account a patient's individual characteristics, medical history, and genetic information, these models can help doctors choose the treatments that are most likely to be effective for that particular patient.
So instead of a one-size-fits-all approach to healthcare,
Right.
we're moving towards a more tailored approach, where treatments are customized to each individual's needs and circumstances.
Exactly. And this is just the beginning. As these probabilistic models become more sophisticated and as we gather more data, the potential for personalized medicine is truly enormous.
It's incredible to think about the impact this technology is having on healthcare and on our lives in general. But I have to ask, are there any challenges or limitations we need to be aware of when it comes to using these probabilistic models? I mean, after all, no technology is perfect, right?
You're absolutely right. While probabilistic machine learning offers powerful tools, it's not a silver bullet. One of the key challenges is ensuring that we have enough high-quality data to train these models effectively. If the data is biased or incomplete, the models will reflect those flaws.
So garbage in, garbage out, as they say.
Exactly. And even with good data, building and interpreting these models requires a deep understanding of both statistics and the specific domain in which they're being applied.
I imagine that's the Murphy's book comes in handy. It sounds like it provides a really solid foundation for understanding the theoretical underpinnings of these models.
Absolutely. And while the book does require a certain level of mathematical sophistication, it's written in a way that's accessible to a wide audience.
Well, that's good to hear because up until this point, we've mostly focused on the applications and implications of Murphy's work. But let's get real for a moment. This is a dense book. Lots of equations, lots of technical jargon for someone who's just starting out in machine learning. Or maybe someone who's a bit rusty on their math skills tackling this book might feel like climbing Mount Everest in flip-flops. Any advice for our listeners who are feeling a little intimidated by the sheer volume of technical content?
You're right, it can be daunting, but my advice would be don't be afraid to start small. You don't need to understand every single equation on the first pass.
Right.
Focus on grasping the core concepts and then gradually work your way up to the more complex material.
So start with a base camp, get acclimated to the altitude, and then gradually make your way towards the summit.
Exactly. And don't hesitate to reread sections that you find challenging. Sometimes concepts become clearer the second or third time around.
That's good advice for any challenging book, really. And it's encouraging to know that even seasoned experts sometimes have to go back and revisit foundational material. So for our listeners who are ready to embark on this probabilistic machine learning journey, what key takeaways would you want them to keep in mind as they delve into Murphy's book?
I think the most important takeaway is that probability is the language of uncertainty. And mastering that language is essential for anyone who wants to truly understand and harness the power of machine learning.
Because the world is rarely black and white, right?
Right.
There are shades of gray everywhere we look, and we need tools to navigate that uncertainty.
Precisely. And Murphy's book gives us those tools. It provides a framework for thinking about machine learning in a way that embraces uncertainty, quantifies risk, and ultimately leads to more robust and reliable models.
So it's not just about building models that make predictions. It's about building models that we can trust, and that can help us make better decisions in a world that's full of uncertainty. Well said. Now, before we move on to our final segment, I'm curious, what's one thing from Murphy's book that really resonated with you personally? What was your aha moment?
Well, one thing that really struck me was how Murphy emphasizes the importance of choosing the right probability distribution for your model. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we've talked about all these different types of machine learning problems.
Right.
So I imagine the kind of data you're working with would influence which distribution is most appropriate?
Exactly. For example, if you're modeling a binary outcome, like whether a customer will click on an ad or not,
Okay.
a Bernoulli distribution would be a natural choice.
Yeah,
But if you're modeling something like the number of cars passing a certain point on a highway,
right.
you'd want to use a Poisson distribution.
So it's about understanding the nature of the data
Yes,
and then choosing the statistical tool that best reflects that nature.
precisely. And what's fascinating is that Murphy doesn't just present these distributions as abstract mathematical concepts.
Right.
He connects them to real-world machine learning problems, showing how the choice of distribution can actually impact the performance of your model.
Oh, interesting. Can you give us an example of how that plays out in practice?
Sure. Let's say you're building a model to predict stock prices. A common approach is to use a Gaussian distribution to model the returns, assuming they're normally distributed.
Right.
But in reality, stock returns often exhibit what's called fat tails,
Fat tails. Okay.
meaning that extreme events are more likely than a Gaussian distribution would suggest.
So using the wrong distribution in that case
Yeah,
could lead to underestimating the risk of large price swings.
exactly. And that could have serious consequences for investors who are relying on that model to make decisions. By choosing a distribution that more accurately reflects the actual behavior of stock prices,
Yeah,
you can build a more robust and reliable model.
that's a great example. You know how these seemingly abstract statistical concepts have very real-world implications?
Oh, absolutely.
Now, speaking of real-world implications, we've talked a lot about how probabilistic machine learning is being used in various industries, but I'm also curious about the broader societal impact of this technology. Are there any potential ethical considerations we need to be thinking about as these models become more pervasive in our lives?
Yeah, you raise an important point. Like any powerful tool, probabilistic machine learning can be used for good or for ill.
Right.
It's up to us as a society to ensure that this technology is developed and deployed responsibly.
So it's not just about the technical aspects of building these models.
Right.
It's also about thinking carefully about the values and principles that guide their application.
Exactly. For example, we need to make sure that these models are fair and unbiased, that they don't perpetuate existing societal inequalities. We also need to be mindful of privacy concerns, as these models often require access to vast amounts of personal data.
It's like we're elevating a new era,
Yeah,
and we need to establish a set of ethical guidelines for how to navigate this uncharted territory.
I agree. And I think Murphy's book is a valuable resource for anyone who wants to engage in this conversation.
Okay.
He doesn't shy away from these challenging questions, and he encourages readers to think critically about the societal impact of the technology they're building.
So it's not just a technical manual.
No.
It's also a call to action for data scientists and machine learning practitioners to be responsible stewards of this powerful technology.
Precisely. Now, as we wrap up our deep dive into Kevin Murphy's book, I'd like to leave our listeners with a challenge.
Ooh, I love a good challenge. What do you have in mind?
Think about how the concepts we've discussed, Bayesian instance, probability distributions, model selection, might be relevant to your own work or area of interest.
Yeah, because these ideas aren't just confined to the realm of computer science.
Right.
They have applications in all sorts of fields.
Exactly. Whether you're a scientist, a business analyst, a policymaker, or simply a curious individual, the ability to think probabilistically is becoming increasingly valuable in today's world.
So it's about embracing uncertainty,
Yes,
quantifying risk, and making decisions based on the best available evidence.
precisely. And I think that's a powerful message to take away from Murphy's book.
Well said. So to our listeners, we encourage you to pick up Kevin Murphy's Machine Learning, A Probabilistic Perspective, and embark on your own probabilistic journey.
It's a challenging but rewarding read that will change the way you think about the world.
And until next time, keep diving deep.